The last thing anyone wants before takeoff is an unnecessary delay, especially one caused by a full-blown meltdown at 30,000 feet. But that's exactly what happened when a male Karen took his entitlement to the next level, sparking a fiery showdown with a no-nonsense flight attendant. What started as a simple request quickly spiraled into chaos, leaving passengers stuck on the tarmac and questioning how one man's tantrum could hold an entire flight hostage. The sun dipped lower over Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. Inside Terminal 4, the usual chaos unfolded. Families herding children, business travelers balancing phone calls with rolling suitcases, and airport staff making their routine announcements over the intercom. The smell of overpriced fast food and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mixing with the faint whiff of jet fuel drifting in from the tarmac. Standing near Gate 32B, Jonathan Mitchell checked his watch with a sharp sigh. He hated airports. They were loud, inefficient, and full of people who didn't know how to move with urgency. At 46, Jonathan prided himself on being a no-nonsense businessman, someone who didn't have time for nonsense. He had spent years building his reputation as a tough, respected executive in the corporate world. But tonight, as he prepared to board Flight 782 to New York, his patience was already wearing thin. The line at the gate had started moving, but far too slowly for his liking. First, the gate agents called for families traveling with small children. Jonathan scoffed. Why should parents get priority just because they couldn't plan their lives better? Then came first-class passengers, people who had paid a little extra to avoid rubbing elbows with the common travelers. Jonathan wasn't in first class. Normally he would be, but thanks to a last-minute itinerary change, he was bumped to business class. It was still decent seating, but not what he felt he deserved. As he waited, Jonathan noticed a young couple in their early 20s at the front of the queue, fumbling with their phones, trying to pull up their boarding passes. The gate agents smiled patiently as they searched. Jonathan rolled his eyes. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Another man nearby, a middle-aged traveler in a rumpled blazer, turned toward him. "Airport etiquette is lost on some people," he said with a knowing smirk. Jonathan smirked back. "Exactly. It's not that hard to be prepared." When the agent finally called for business class, Jonathan exhaled sharply and strode forward with purpose. His carry-on, a sleek, monogrammed Toomey suitcase, rolled smoothly behind him. He handed his boarding pass to the agent, expecting a quick scan and nod. Instead, she paused, furrowing her brow. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, glancing at her screen. "It looks like your seat has changed. You're still in business class, but we had to move you to accommodate a family that needed to sit together." Jonathan blinked. "You moved me?" "Yes, sir. Your new seat is 4A, still a window seat," she explained, her tone polite but firm. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "That's not acceptable. I specifically chose 2D because it's an aisle seat. I need easy access to get off the plane quickly." "I understand, sir, but the change was necessary." Jonathan clenched his teeth. He wanted to argue further, but he could feel people shifting impatiently behind him. With a final glare at the agent, he snatched his boarding pass and stomped toward the jet bridge. Stepping onto the aircraft, Jonathan's irritation grew. The American Airlines Boeing 777 was bustling with passengers settling into their seats, stuffing carry-ons into overhead bins, and waving down flight attendants for assistance. The faint hum of the plane's engines vibrated through the floor beneath his feet. As he approached his new seat, 4A, he saw his seatmate, an older man in his late 60s, wearing a navy blue polo and reading glasses. The man looked up briefly and gave Jonathan a nod before returning to his newspaper. Jonathan exhaled sharply and threw himself into his seat, the window seat, a seat he didn't want. He preferred aisle seats for quick exits, and now he'd have to wait for the entire business class section to disembark before he could move. He unbuttoned his blazer, shoved it into the seat pocket in front of him, and pulled out his phone to check emails. A few messages from his assistant about his New York meeting popped up. He had spent weeks preparing for this business pitch, and any delay could cost him a valuable deal. He was still stewing in frustration when a baby's cry rang through the cabin. Jonathan's head snapped toward the sound. A few rows behind him, a young mother was cradling an infant in her arms, gently rocking the child back and forth. The baby's cries intensified, and Jonathan's patience evaporated. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. The older man beside him chuckled softly. Kids on flights, huh? At that moment, a flight attendant approached. Emily, her name tag read. She had the poise of someone who had seen it all from drunk businessmen to panicked first-time flyers. "Good evening, sir. Can I offer you a pre-flight beverage?" she asked, her smile unwavering. Jonathan barely looked at her. "Scotch. Neat." Emily nodded and disappeared down the aisle. A few minutes later, she returned with a glass of amber liquid, setting it on his tray table. Jonathan took a long sip, letting the burn calm his nerves. As the plane taxied to the runway, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to heavy air traffic, we will have a slight delay before takeoff. We appreciate your patience." Jonathan's fingers tightened around his glass. "Unbelievable," he muttered. Emily, passing by, overheard. "Is everything all right, sir?" "No," he snapped. "Everything is not all right. I have places to be, and this airline clearly doesn't care." "I understand your frustration," Emily replied, still calm. "We'll do our best to make up for lost time once we're airborne." Jonathan ignored her, staring straight ahead. This night was already off to a bad start, and soon it was about to get much, much worse. As the plane taxied to the runway, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, informing passengers of a slight delay due to air traffic congestion. A collective groan echoed through the cabin, and Jonathan's patience wore thin. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, taking a swig of his scotch. Emily, passing by, overheard his comment and paused. "Is everything all right, sir?" "No, everything is not all right," Jonathan snapped. "I have a tight schedule, and this delay is unacceptable." "I understand your frustration," Emily replied calmly. "We'll do our best to make up time once we're airborne." Jonathan merely huffed in response, turning his attention to the in-flight magazine. An hour into the flight, with dinner service underway, Jonathan had consumed several more scotches. His demeanor shifted from irritable to confrontational. Noticing that his glass was empty, he signaled for Emily. "Another scotch?" he demanded. Emily, maintaining her professionalism, replied, "I'm sorry, sir, but I believe you've had enough. For your safety and the comfort of other passengers, I can't serve you more alcohol." Jonathan's face reddened with anger. "Do you know who I am? I demand to speak to your supervisor." At that moment, Mark, the lead flight attendant, approached, sensing the escalating situation. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes, there's a problem," Jonathan retorted. "Your attendant refuses to serve me a drink. This is outrageous." "Sir, our primary concern is the safety and well-being of all passengers," Mark explained. "We have the right to refuse service if we believe it could lead to a disturbance." Jonathan stood up abruptly, knocking his tray table and causing his empty glass to shatter on the floor. "This is unacceptable. I will not be treated this way." The commotion drew the attention of nearby passengers. The young mother clutched her baby tighter, and the elderly couple exchanged worried glances. Mark raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Sir, please lower your voice and return to your seat," he said firmly. "I will not," Jonathan shouted. "I demand respect." At that moment, the plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing it to jolt. Jonathan lost his balance and stumbled into the aisle, colliding with a passenger who was returning from the restroom. "Watch where you're going," Jonathan barked. The passenger, taken aback, raised his hands defensively. "I think you've had enough, buddy." Jonathan took a threatening step forward, but Mark intervened, positioning himself between the two men. "Sir, I must insist that you return to your seat immediately," Mark said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Breathing heavily, Jonathan glared at Mark but reluctantly complied, muttering under his breath. The turbulence subsided, but the tension in the cabin remained palpable. Jonathan sat fuming, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He pressed the call button repeatedly, but the attendants, following protocol, chose to monitor him from a distance rather than engage further. Minutes felt like hours as Jonathan stewed in his seat. His mind raced, fueled by alcohol and indignation. He convinced himself that he was the victim of gross mistreatment and that drastic measures were necessary to assert his authority. Without warning, Jonathan unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, his movements unsteady. He made his way toward the front of the cabin, where the flight attendants were stationed. "Sir, you need to return to your seat," Emily said, stepping forward to block his path. "I need to speak to the captain," Jonathan slurred. "This flight is a disaster, and I won't stand for it." "Sir, please return to your seat," Emily repeated, her voice firm. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Get out of my way," he growled, attempting to push past her. Emily stood her ground, and Mark quickly joined her. "Sir, if you don't return to your seat, we'll have no choice but to restrain you." Jonathan laughed derisively. "I'd like to see you try." Restraint. The situation had reached a critical point. Mark nodded to Emily, who retrieved a set of restraint cuffs from the emergency kit. Jonathan's bravado faltered as he realized they were serious. "You can't do this," he protested, backing away. "I'll sue you all." "Sir, this is your final warning," Mark said. "Sit down and remain calm, or we will restrain you for the remainder of the flight." Passengers watched in tense silence, some recording the incident on their phones. Jonathan glanced around, seeing no support in the faces staring back at him. Defeated, he slumped into the nearest seat. Emily and Mark approached cautiously, securing the restraint cuffs around his wrists and fastening them to the armrest. Jonathan offered no resistance, his earlier defiance extinguished. The rest of the flight proceeded without incident. Upon landing at JFK, airport security and law enforcement officers boarded the plane to escort Jonathan off. Passengers sighed in relief, grateful that the ordeal had ended without further escalation. In the terminal, Jonathan was taken into custody and charged with interfering with a flight crew and disorderly conduct. His employer was notified, and the business meeting he had been so eager to attend proceeded without him. The incident made headlines, serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of disruptive behavior on flights. Discussions about air rage and passenger conduct resurfaced, and just like that, one man's tantrum grounded an entire plane. Was it worth the viral embarrassment and the side eyes from every passenger on board? Next time you're tempted to pick a fight at 30,000 feet, just remember phones are always recording, and the internet never forgets.